Greetings. One of the purest and best indicators of the impact of technological progress on future economic progress is the advancement of supercomputer performance statistics. Now that may seem like a very esoteric and dry subject, since most of you have never ever seen a supercomputer in your lives before and probably never will. You may have a vague perception of a supercomputer being a series of refrigerator-sized cabinets that are lined up in a row, and there's a corridor in between two such rows of machines. And that is accurate. That's what most supercomputers look like. But the reason that supercomputing is the purest indicator of not only computing progress, but therefore a predictor of economic progress and a measurement of how far below the trend line we might be, or whether we are at the trend line for both computing as well as economic progress, is because all the resources of a supercomputer go towards computing. As it is not a consumer product, it doesn't have to worry about a number of things like heat or design or some user interface and other such bells and whistles that make it more suitable for the average consumer. A supercomputer, as we saw, is just purely utilitarian. Now this website, Top 500, checks the statistics of all the supercomputers in the world. And if you go to statistics on this webpage and performance development, you get to this chart that I have here right now. Now, of these three lines, the orange line is the least interesting. It shows the performance of the most powerful supercomputer in the world for a given year. You have years in the horizontal axis, and you have power as measured in trillions of floating point operations per second, or teraflops, in the vertical axis. Now, as you can see here, the trend has been rising, predictably, and the blue line is the measurement of the bottommost member of the top 500 list. So the number 500 most powerful supercomputer in the world is the blue line. And as you can see, being number one doesn't matter much, because within a few years' time, number one is only as powerful as what number 500 will be in a certain amount of years. Now, for a long time, there was about a 7-year gap between number one and number 500, and both were rising about 10x every 4 years. And now it seems to be flatlining. Again, the orange line is not the measure of actual trend line because it's not enough data. That's just the one supercomputer that happens to be at the top. But the blue, number 500, is far less riggable, of course, and therefore more interesting. But the green line is the most interesting of all. It is the sum of all of the top 500 supercomputers in the world. And it too was rising at a very steady rate, going about 10x every 4 years, until about 2013 or so, when it started to get to a slower trajectory. And that is a bit worrisome, because why was this trend line so stable and now we're lagging this trend line? Now if you go down, they have a similar chart which has trend lines in it, and I don't know why they had to have two separate charts, but that's what the website has. And it just shows the trend line and how it is pulling down the actual trend line and being below that. However, the trend line of all this data is not the truly valid trend line, because it is validating the deviation of the trend line to the downside, which it should not. We can therefore measure how far behind we are technologically relative to where we might have been had the original trend line not been interrupted. And the reason this trend line is flattening is because the existing paradigm of computing has reached a point of saturation. Every last drop of juice has been squeezed out of the existing paradigm of computing. Various components are too far apart, and even though the speed of light is very fast, if components are inches apart and you have to do billions of calculations per second, being inches apart takes too much time for light to go back and forth a billion times, for example. Things like memory, processing, and storage are also not integrated into one component, which is another problem. And since every computer engineering professional over the last 50 years has learned a certain way of doing things, they cannot envision a new computing architecture very easily. We get media reports of things like quantum computing and so forth. However, 5 or 6 technologies have all been candidates for the next paradigm of computing. Around 2000, 2001, you had carbon buckyballs, Buckminster fullerene. After that, you had carbon nanotubes. Then you had DNA computing. Then you had graphene computing. Now you have quantum computing. But none of these have truly panned out. I happen to be involved in a company that is figuring out another model for computing, and we hope to do very well, but that's all I'm going to say about that right now. But as per this chart, the fact is that we are due for a snapback to the trend line. So let us move over to a slightly modified chart that I made. So the same three lines, and the green line being the sum of the top 500 supercomputers. If you take a trend line that sustains it at the pre-2013 trajectory, you see a quantification of how far behind we are. Just to revert back to this green line, there would have to be a 100x gain by 2025. To intercept the trend line in 2029, there would have to be a 1000x gain from current levels. The new paradigm of computing will therefore happen relatively soon because there's a tremendous amount of pressure to revert back to this trend line. And all of those technologies that I mentioned before, many may have a role to play, but they have not been able to figure this out, and that's why we don't have a new paradigm of computing. This is also why a lot of predictions by Ray Kurzweil are years behind schedule, because he believed this original pre-2013 trend line could never be interrupted. And to be fair, why should it be interrupted when it seemed to be so steady up to that point? That is why most of his predictions are 5 to 8 years behind schedule. And they're all behind by the same amount, as I discuss in other videos as well. So to revert back to this trend line would involve a very, very rapid increase in computational power. And as I said, 100x gain just to intercept in 2025. And whichever company or group of companies figures out the new model of computing will not only make a huge amount of money, but will be responsible for getting all technological innovation and economic progress back on track. The reason I have this line pointing to missing economic prosperity is that the gap between the two lines, the actual green line performance with all the circular dots and the trend line, as those two diverge further, it quantifies the missing economic prosperity that has not come to us, which might have come to us if computing were still on the green trend line. And this takes many, many forms. Many cures for diseases that might have arrived have not arrived because we don't have the tools to do all the crunching of numbers and calculations to conduct that innovation. Discoveries of all sorts of information at the genomic level would have happened much sooner than they did if computing were back at its trend line. We would also have discovered a lot more extrasolar planets and other astronomical phenomena today relative to what we have if computing were at its trend line. Now it will revert back to this trend line. It's just a question of creating a new paradigm of computing. And this is going to happen within this decade, the 2020s, just because as the two lines get further and further apart, the pressure of reversion rises exponentially. And this is definitely something to be on the lookout for. And another indicator, more subjective, is that a lot of investors are so discouraged that there could ever be a new paradigm of computing that they have given up looking. And their expectations have been lowered, and they're impressed with smaller and smaller gains in innovation, which is unfortunate, but their expectations have been lowered to such an extent that that is what they are accustomed to. The reversion back to this trend line will be a dramatic technological revolution. And like I said, it would be a 100x gain in the next 4 years or a 1000x gain in the next 8 years is what would have to happen and will happen in one form or the other because of this reversion to the trend line. In the long run, these trend lines never break. They have existed for 4 billion years on the Earth, and I have other videos elaborating on that and supporting that with data. And here, this is an indicator to look at. So we can see the updates every 3 months on this top 500 website for Supercomputing Progress. And when we finally see that there is a reversion back, there'll be all kinds of headlines about new computing and new supercomputers and all kinds of problems that seemed years away that are now fixable. But in fact, they only seemed years away because we were behind the trend line by years. So all this is going to be very fun to watch. But keep this principle in mind because this is the source by which you can actually measure the extent of underperformance and the missing economic prosperity. It's a very profound subject, but it is ultimately the most important subject that affects virtually everything else in the world. Some food for thought for sure. Now, if you find this type of content interesting, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, and thank you very much for watching.